Good morning, world. This is Steve Rao, live from Cary, North Carolina, the host of Roku and Pod TV's World Edition. On the show, we talk about global affairs, innovation, a post pandemic world, and an increasingly divisive world politically. As we've closed out the midterm elections, the United States House of Representatives is now in the hands of the Republicans, with Kevin McCarthy projected to become the next speaker, and a Democratic House with a Democratic president who just had a really pretty successful midterms. I will be opening up with my monologue today, but we welcome you. I'm here at a conference. So I'm going to have to step out for a few minutes to meet someone, and then I'll be coming back. But I wanted to open up today with, first of all, the breaking news that the conflict in Ukraine spilled into NATO yesterday. A Russian-made missile exploded in a Polish village near the Ukrainian border. There's no evidence that the missile came from Russia, but this does matter because Poland is a NATO country, and other alliance members are required to actually are bound by treaty and to defend if it's attacked. Are we on the verge of nuclear war or World War III? We will soon find out. But my monologue today is based on a very historic event. The first time in the history of the United States, actually the second time, that a former president, in this case Donald J. Trump, after being defeated in a presidential election, is announced his candidacy for the next election to be president of the United States. Only one president in the U.S. history, Grover Cleveland, was unsuccessful and came back in the 1890s. Now, I just want to say that President Trump's speech, it was much more focused on policy, a much more tempered president, Trump, who talked not so much about the 2020 elections, but America was in a much better place in his hands. Now, I did take the liberty of doing some fact checking of the president's speech. It took me a while, but I just wanted to bring some of these points up for you all to talk about. And these are not from liberal news media. These are actually from my own numbers that I pulled from the Department of Defense and some other sources that I have been able to pull together. But the president mentioned, first of all, that the United States of America left $85 billion worth of weapons in Afghanistan. Simply not true. 18.1 billion was the number from the Department of Defense between 2005 and 2017, and it appears about $7.1 billion of equipment was left. In terms of the petroleum reserves, that they're completely drained, that he filled it up, not necessarily true, but not completely the president's fault. They do have to sell some of the reserves, and Congress did block some of the funding that President Trump wanted to do of filling up the reserves. But the reserves were not as full, completely full when he left office. In terms of tariffs, that he's the first president of the United States to impose tariffs. I was an economics major at Emory. We've been imposing tariffs on China for over 2 centuries, and we receive about 12.3 billion in revenue from our customs and tariffs just from China over the last 2 decades. In terms of sea levels, yes, we agree with the former president that we don't want to be in nuclear war, but the idea that our sea levels are going to rise only 1/8 an inch in 300 years is simply false. The scientists say that 10 to 12 inches over the next 30 years. I could go on and on. You can debate these numbers with me, but the bottom line is a number of these facts were false and off, but we'll see what happens in the future. I will be back in a few minutes. Thank you so much. Let's get started.
Glad to get started, and definitely, as Steve said, we've got some amazing guests, including a very special guest that'll be joining us to talk about an issue as well. And of course, we're looking forward to some conversation with a gentleman that's been involved in obstetrics and things in that space, right? Definitely along those lines. I think I pronounced the field correctly and all of that, but it's those folks that are involved in baby care and all in that kind of space and all in that line. So I'm going to bring him on. And there are a couple of other issues that I was going to talk about as well, including one that involves rice and one that involves the Ukraine. So definitely I'll just bring those up and we can talk about them after we have some conversations with Alan Lindemann. And of course, we'll bring up the other guests as well. But the stories that I had seen when I was looking up news stories was the fact that there is some question as to whether a attack that took place on Poland actually came from the Ukraine as opposed to Russia, because Russia is saying that the Kiev forces fired the missile that hit Poland instead of hitting Russia. So that is definitely going to be something that folks in NATO will be discussing and that they will be looking at as that horrible war continues and all in that space. So they may have drawn another country into the conflict, but let's hope not. At least that's my hope, and I think it's the hope of many folks, and actually say the vast majority of the folks in the world and all in that space. And we can definitely get into some discussions around that. I know that me and Shaquille sometimes talk about that lovely topic of race, or as Chris Greco likes to call it, rice, and all of that. But there was a incident that took place in Georgia that involved one of the historically black colleges, and they were actually saying that it was a juvenile that was behind the bomb threat at Georgia's historically black colleges and all in that space. And that was the FBI that reported that. I'm actually wondering if my cousin, who is a Georgia Bureau of Investigation officer, is involved in that case. And I might have to reach out to him and see if he is, and if he wants to come on and talk about it or talk about what he knows and all in that space. But one of the things that I found interesting was that apparently, there's all times conversations around hate crimes and what that constitutes and what it is and all in that space. And a federal investigator said that the one person, a juvenile not identified because of his age, is responsible for bomb threats earlier this year targeting historically black colleges, including Georgia campuses. But the suspect is too young to face federal hate crime charges, the FBI said this week. Instead, the agency is working with state prosecutors. Dozens of additional threats of violence remain under investigation and could have originated outside of the United States. So I'm actually wondering, at what age are you going to allow people to get away with hate crime kind of things, no matter what the hate crimes are? Because I'm wondering even what age the kid is. Is the kid like 6 or 7 or whatever in that space? But just in case you're wondering about the colleges, they include Spelman, Albany State University, and Fort Valley State University, all that received threats within the same week. And the threat led many HBCU students and leaders to push for enhanced security, including requiring students to use their ID to enter some campus buildings. So, and like I said, a lot of those colleges definitely have some historical significance and all in that space. And apparently there was over 200 colleges, 250 colleges that were part of another threat that happened as well. And 7 of those were HBCUs, along with more than 100 high schools and two junior highs, and all in that space. So if it was one individual, and it sounds like there might have been more, they really didn't have that much to do, or maybe they were just bored. Who knows what was going on in that space? But I know maybe Chris has got some thoughts around that. Maybe Shaquille does, and of course others may do as well. But I did promise him that I was going to bring in Dr. Alan Lindemann and all in that space, and I'm glad that you were able to make it. I know that you've been with us before, and one of the things that I know that you talked about, because that is definitely around Roe versus Wade and a number of other things. But one of the things that I saw that you talked about is whether birth is safer at home or in the hospital, and why is the maternal death rate so high in the U.S.? So I'd love to know some more about that, because I do know that a lot of times people are thinking that we have, and I don't argue this, some of the best healthcare in the world and all of that. So that being said, what is with the amount of maternal death rates, and why is it so high, and what are we defining as so high? And also, is birth safer at home or in a hospital? Because I do know some people that have even considered being doulas and things in that space. So before I bring in our other panelists, I would love to hear from you around that thought and around that issue.
Well, thank you, Mark, very much. I'm very happy to be back with you again today. There's, when we started talking about this missile, the first thing I thought about was, where did it come from? So that's really apparently everybody's concern, is who sent it. Anyway, let's look at the missile that we have to do with healthcare today. And I want to talk a little bit about, you brought up the maternal mortality rate.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at here an average of 20 to 23 per 100,000. That's an average. If you look at Native Americans and Native Alaskans, it's 40 per 100,000. And if you look at women of color, it's 55 per 100,000. So why the disparity? Partly, I think it's access. In other words, there's probably more women of color working, and actually who need to work to pay for the rent. They have to Maybe they have a job as a food server or something. They don't get to go to their appointments. And even if they do get to go to their appointments, they often have a doctor who doesn't listen to them as much as they might listen to a white woman. So you have that problem. And even I read some articles about Black or doctors of color giving the same kind of care that white doctors give. So you have to say, why is everybody apparently discriminating against women of color? And I think it's partly because in order to survive a residency, a person of color needs to think like a white person. So we do have, it's a terrible problem, the escalating rate. If you look at countries that do a better job, like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they've got a rate of 2 or 3 per 100,000. We are on the equivalent of Iran. We rank about 33rd or 34th in the world. We have the most expensive healthcare in the world. As a matter of fact, our obstetric care is twice as expensive as Canada, and they have half of the death rate that we have. So we do not perform well. And as time passes, it's getting worse. 40 years ago, when I was a student, we had a maternal mortality rate of 8 or 9 per 100,000. So you have to ask, and everybody ought to be asking why. And certainly our insurance companies, Medicare, Medicaid, Washington, D.C., the American College of the Obstetricians and Gynecologists should be asking why. Now, my why, the reason I think this is happening is because we have very fragmented care. Years ago, when I started practicing, and for my entire practicing life, I saw my patients, I saw my families, moms, dads, kids. I did it all myself. Every single visit, I saw them. Every single visit, I got to see who they were and how they were interacting. And I went there for their deliveries. And that was very useful because we all knew each other. Sometimes dads can kind of get in the way, but if you know dad, he's a real big benefit. So, when I walked into a delivery room and the mom said, I can't do this anymore, she needed to have somebody she could trust and respect to say, yes, you can do this. So I hope I've answered some of your questions.
No, they answered quite a bit of questions. I'm going to bring in some of our other folks. I know that Nick Palveda has been talking about the rise in health costs as well as Social Security and a number of other things in that space. So I know he's got some opinions on this matter, and I'm sure that Lee Newton Rhodes does as well. And I'm sure that even our data analyst and our amazing data analyst, Chris Greco, might have some thoughts. And of course, we've got Shaquille from Down Under and all in that space. So I definitely want to hear some of their thoughts about some of the things that you were talking about and some of the other news items that we may get to as well. But the one question that I was going to ask you, and I know that I've had friends that have definitely gone to the hospital on a regular basis and all along those lines, and I've even had some friends that have even considered having babies later in their life and even reversing procedures to have children and all of that. But I was just wondering, with all of this modern technology and with things going on, that I think we are seeing some mothers that are in their 50s, maybe even some pushing near their late 40s, and who knows, maybe even the 60s, but definitely the 50s and all of that. I was just wondering, with that going on, are the birth rates, and is it easier, because I did mention the doulas earlier, as well as some of the other home health care, for babies to be born at home, or is the hospital the better way to go? Because a lot of people will tell you that with modern day things going on and with the pandemic, that some people don't feel all that safe in a hospital. They sometimes think it might even be a germ factory and all in that space, even though they do try to do a good job of staying protected in that regards. But I'm just wondering your take on births and whether they are safer at home or in a hospital.
Well, you're right. As time passes, we're probably pushing the pendulum in the direction of home births. The reason that women are going that way is for autonomy. That's number one. In other words, things don't happen to them without their control or without their knowledge. They're also, as you have said, more likely to have a doula or a midwife who comes to visit them frequently, who they know. If you look at the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, of course, they hate home birth. And they say that the neonatal death rate is twice at home what it is in the hospital. I don't think that's true, but I also don't think we have any good answers. And the American College kind of tempers this a little bit, and they say, well, you have to have if you're going to deliver at home, it should be less than 15 minutes from the hospital, and you should deliver on the main floor. In other words, not try to go up and down steps when you're on your way to have a cesarean section in the hospital.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Like I said, I do know, and I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, some folks that are thinking about having birth at a later life. And like I said, some of them may have even had the procedures that they have to reverse and all of that if they're going to have any children. But is this something that you are seeing more of in life? And am I correct in thinking that we are seeing more late life births because a lot of the women in the workforce started going to work and devoting themselves to career and less the child care, and decided to become parents or mothers later in life? Or am I incorrect in thinking that?
Well, I think you're right on. I guess we'd say spot on now. We certainly have the ability now to get pregnant at 50 years old. For example, there is such a thing as in vitro. In other words, you could even get pregnant with somebody else's ovum, somebody else's egg, and your husband's sperm. You could do that. I've had several patients who've done that, and they seem to do well with it. So you've got that issue. I have a daughter-in-law who's had 8 children, and 6 of them she's delivered at home, and I believe she's probably about 50, and the last one was born about 2 years ago. So she's had no trouble with her home deliveries. As a matter of fact, she had more trouble with her hospital delivery. Baby wound up in the neonatal intensive care unit. So it happens. And I think that certainly there's a good way to do it. For example, if you look at Sweden, the Northern European countries, you have 3 choices for your delivery. You can deliver at home with a midwife, you can deliver in a birthing center with the midwife, or you can deliver in a hospital with a doctor. So they obviously do a very good job of home deliveries because their maternal mortality rate is only 2 to 3 per 100,000. And there's no evidence that they have an increased neonatal morbidity or mortality rate either.
It makes sense. Hey, Chris, do you have any thoughts, or any of our other guests? Lee Newton Rhodes is with us. Nick, I know you've oftentimes talked about some of the things going on in the medical industry and all of that. So
Yeah,
I'm glad that Dr. Lindeman was able to come back. So,
Yes.
Chris, it's on you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so I have a share screen up. I'd like to confirm Dr. Lindeman's data. According to the World Factbook CIA, yes, that's true. Norway has 2 deaths per 100,000 live births and a maternal mortality rate. United States has 16, or has 19, and Iran has 16. So yes, we're close. We're closer to Iran than we are Norway. But I think that the most, and I get where you're coming from, Dr. Lindeman. I really do. From the standpoint of treating people, equally, from the standpoint of making sure that you have that type of physician assistance, that type of thing. But I have to tell you, Norway is Norway. Norway, take a look at the number of minorities in Norway. Take a look at the number of people that are different in Norway. Take a look at the difference in the individuals, and then take a look at the United States. Now, Iran, they don't have an excuse. I mean, Iranians are Iranians. They have very few immigration issues because nobody wants to go to Iran. But basically, Norway is never going to be like United States, and United States is never going to be like Norway. But I think that you bring up a good point, is that the teaching hospitals need to teach, and it doesn't, not just teaching procedure or surgical procedure or different types of freaking checklists that you go down and you say they have this and this and this and this. The diagnosis is this. I think that you're right. I mean, I've had physicians tell me within the last year that I did not need a medical procedure. And that just shocked the hell out of me. I just had a cardiac catheterization. And after I got out of there, the guy said, you had a 70 and 80% blockage. But I took a look. The one blockage is almost totally, it's almost totally bypassed naturally. And the other one, if I go in and I try to put a stent in there, I'm going to knock up against this other artery, which is going to cause a blockage. I don't want to do that. He says, you're asymptomatic. He says, you're running, you're doing everything you need to do. I'm not going to mess with that. He says, if you become symptomatic, you come on back. But in the meantime, I don't see anything else within your history or whatever else that I'm going to have to do a procedure on you. And you know what I told him? Thank you. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for not having to go in there and do that stuff. Now, if that's what they're teaching doctors now, that, hey, look, if it's not bothering you, if you don't have pain, then you know something, it's not something I have to do. It's not something I need to do. I'm going to back off. Also, the history aspect. If you have a minority, specifically, and Mark confirmed this, if you have a minority, specifically Black, they are more prone to hypertension, which means preeclampsia, and the other things need to go along with that. So they need to consider that immediately upon entry into any type of birthing situation. The minority women, specifically Black, or if they have any African in their legacy whatsoever, they need to consider the possibility of hypertension. And that's a situation where I think if you consider the differences there, I think that would help. But I totally agree. Your facts are correct. I mean, Norway has 2, we have 19. It's incontrovertible. I mean, it's hopefully we can do better in the future. I'd love to do better in the future, especially my daughter's about to have a baby here in May. She's having some issues. I want to make sure that she gets the best possible care, whether she's white, Black, or purple. I don't care. Just make sure that the doctor understands that every individual is just that individual. I really appreciate you saying that. I do.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that as well. One of the questions I was going to ask you, Dr. Lindemann, I know Lee probably has some thoughts as well, is that you've got a 40-year history of being a obstetric doctor and all in that space. And in that 40 years, you've never lost a patient or had one suffer eclampsia or a stroke. So what advice do you give to others that they can have that kind of success rate? Because that's just, to me, amazing. Because, 40 years of delivering babies and over 6,000 or more, and you never lost one at all. That is definitely the work of those above and all in that, but definitely also your own training. So what advice do you give that others can have that kind of luck and success? Because that's just truly amazing to me.
Well, you're right. Some of that is luck. And a lot of people say it's better to be lucky than to be good. But I'm going to go back to the point that Chris made, and that is that each patient needs to be fully understood on the first visit. The other problem that we really need to deal with is what happens. In other words, we can't blame the patient for being sick. That's called medical gaslighting. And that's one of the problems we have. Whenever we start doing that, we get bad outcomes. And it is without fail. Yes, I was lucky. I had a lot of Norwegian patients in my practice. I had a lot of Germans, Russians, Italians. Yes, I had some Blacks, and I never had any trouble with any of them. But yes, we know that Blacks have hypertension. And again, that's something we should know and we should treat and deal with from the beginning, the first visit.
No doubt.
See them as often as they need to be seen.
Yep. Lee, did you have any thoughts or things that you want to add to the conversation and everything? So I see Lee has popped back in and all in that space. So didn't know if Lee had any thoughts that he wanted to add.
Yeah, thanks. I do. I appreciate that. My Wi-Fi here is acting up, but real quickly, we're talking about women who are getting a birth later in life for the first birth. Is there an increased risk of breast cancer for them, or any risk to the baby and being a Down syndrome, or any other to the mother or baby for the first pregnancy?
Well, this is kind of ironic, but the majority of the Down syndromes occur in women under 35. And now that does not mean that your risk for each baby goes down as you get older. It simply means that women under 35 have more babies than women over 35. But certainly there are risks that occur as you get older. Downs risk is probably about 1 in 40 when you get up into your mid 40s versus 1 in 300 when you're, in your early 30s. So the risk goes up. But the other thing that happens with risk, and these are independent factors, hypertension is one of the problems, and bleeding is another one. In other words, bleeding at delivery. And still, in spite of the fact that our number one cause of maternal mortality today is behavioral, that is suicide, homicide, and stillbirth, hemorrhage is the next biggest cause of death, and it occurs at the time of delivery or the first few days afterwards.
Definitely appreciate
And how about,
that.
I'm sorry, and how about breast cancer?
I'm sorry, I didn't answer that. If anything, pregnancy is protective. In other words, if you have 8 children, you should have less risk for breast cancer and for ovarian cancer than if you have no children. If I look at
I'm sorry, even if for the first pregnancy over 35?
I would say that there would be benefit to any woman at any time from being pregnant. It really shuts off some of the hormones. And especially, like I said, in my experience, the women who present with ovarian cancer have 2 children, and I do not know why. That's just my, experience of one.
Thank you.
Appreciate you and everything. I'm going to switch topics and all of that. As I mentioned earlier, I know that there's been a lot of conversation around the Russia, and I know that later on this week, Sasha will be talking about it again with the show Russia, Ukraine, China, and all in that space. But a lot of conversation has been going around the missile attack that just took place and all of that. Apparently, Poland was hit, and now the individual sides are blaming each other. So I was just wondering your take on that, Sasha, and any latest news that you have, because that was something that I was seeing in the news as well.
Well, it's still an open question. There are a lot of investigations going on. I've noted that Biden said that it's highly unlikely that this missiles came from Russia, and if that's true, then the only scenario is it's Ukrainian air defense missiles chasing Russian missiles or airborne missiles attack. They could land, in this case, on the territory on Poland. In both cases, I think, either case, it was unintentional, obviously, and but it has to be dealt with. It has to be all discovered whose missile is that, who is responsible. A lot of apologies will be done, and probably more than that. That's what it is about this missile attack. Unfortunately, the indirect blame on these 2 people who died as a result of this attack is 100% Russian, because they originated this missile attack, to which Ukrainian responded, trying to bring down this Russian-born missiles. So, in any case, the responsibility will be Russian. No doubt about
You know something,
Yeah.
Sasha? I absolutely agree with you. I am sick and tired of this bull crap. Enough is enough. When it starts to, I get it. The Ukrainians are busting Russia's ass the whole way with this whole situation. But I'm going to tell you something. If I were Biden, and I thank God I'm not, because I'd like to be able to know what I ate for breakfast this morning. The bottom line is that I would sit there and say, I've had enough. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to put troops in Ukraine, and we're going to start. If one missile comes out of there, we are going to pound the hell out of that area. We're done. You're going to sit at the negotiation table, and you're going to figure this thing out, or by God, Russians are going to start dying, and they're going to start dying by the thousands. You just hit a NATO country. We've been very patient with you. We've been forking around with you. These sanctions and everything else. We're going to start destroying cities. We're done. So either stop the bull crap now, or by God, things are gonna happen.
I think the fear is just, and this is Steve Rouse. Sorry, guys, I'm at a conference. I wanted to come in for a few minutes with you guys, but I mean that's a great. Yeah, I think the question is the fear of nuclear war, right? And former President Trump sort of alluded to that yesterday in his talk about nuclear disaster it is quite scary, if we go in there. But how much are we going to take? How much are we just going to sit there? I think the United States of America needs to show strength. We need to make some kind of a statement. And if it's unfortunately, if he fires nuclear weapons on the U.S. or retaliates with nuclear weapons, then it's going to be very scary. I also wanted to get your all's opinions. Maybe I have to leave. Yeah.
Sorry.
What I'll say about former President Trump before I leave is that it wasn't
That was
interesting.
Putin, but Trump same way. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no,
I'm sorry.
no. I mean, he was more tempered in terms of his approach, and I do think he does have a really good chance of winning the nomination because all he has to do is get 30%. But I think that the question is, is it going to divide the Republican Party, and is Trump the best thing for the Republicans to have him as the nominee? I did fact check a lot of his statements which were kind of misleading, not really accurate. But that's a conversation for another time. But the question is, he's come out there now. He is a candidate. How is this going to affect DeSantis and, others that are running? But DeSantis, his statement was very simple. He goes, look at the scoreboard. Look at the scoreboard. And then he ended his press conference, right? So DeSantis is going to run for president. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, folks. But we'll talk about that.
No problem. Along those same lines and everything, I'd be curious to hear, because I know that he had some thoughts around Roe versus Wade when I first approached and heard from Dr. Lindemann. So if he's got any thoughts about the impact of Roe versus Wade, maybe even.
Sorry, before we just change the topic, because Steve's going to go in a few minutes. So
I wasn't changing the topic. I was going to hear from Dr. Lindemann.
President Trump and everything, mate. Okay, go for it.
No, Shaquille, could you respond real quickly, and then we'll go back to Dr. Lindemann. Dr. Lindemann, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm the political analyst, so I had to come on. And Shaquille, could you just respond to what I said before I leave?
So yeah, undoubtedly, President Trump's behavior and demeanor was much better than what we've seen previously. And I think that was a good thing. He probably would have gotten much further had he have been a bit more like that when he was actually the president. If he continues to, let's say, restrain himself and stick to policy issues, I think he probably stands a pretty good chance to win the presidency. I don't think there's any question that he'll win the Republican nomination. Ron DeSantis has a great track record. I think it's a dangerous move for Ron DeSantis, and I said this before Donald Trump announced. I think it's a dangerous move for Ron DeSantis to actually try to run against Trump, and I think that would split the Republican Party. And so I think it'll actually be bad for both candidates if that happens. But again, look, CPAC isn't, CPAC prefers Trump to DeSantis, a number of other PACs that do. So I just don't think that there's a support for Ron DeSantis, and he's really the only Republican that has a chance against Trump. But in relation to fact-checking Trump, that's against Trump for the Republican.
I'm sorry. You're right. Sorry.
In relation to fact-checking Trump, yeah, okay. Look, let me concede everything that you've said is correct. That Trump has misquoted or been a little bit misleading on some of his facts. You can't seriously be sitting there making those sorts of comments and not suggesting anything about Biden. I mean, this is a man that just told America and the rest of the world that when he came into office, that gas prices were $5 and $6 a gallon.
That's not true. I just came back from trip in the United States in 4 states, and there was never price more than $3.55 per gallon.
I mean,
$3.75 per gallon. Stop all these lies. I don't trust that at all.
No, bro, I gotta leave. I've got to leave. But let me just
hang on a second, Sasha. That's not what I said. What President Biden said, what he said in a recent press conference, was that when he became the president, prices were $5 a gallon. They weren't. They were not as high as that. So that's what he said wasn't true.
But President Trump said they were $8, and they were never as high as $8. So I'm just giving you numbers.
In California, they were. Yes, they were.
But what we're saying is that you're happy to fact check and call President Trump's statements. You're happy to do that, but on President Biden, who even the Washington Post had to give him unlimited Pinocchios in some of his comments, Even
There were
left-wing media
statistics.
say,
While he was the president,
look,
he
Sasha,
was
Sasha,
flying on average 33 times
Sasha,
a
we've
day.
got it.
So if you want to
Sasha,
compare Trump with somebody, don't do it with Biden. You have Putin, you have Hitler, you have a lot of people
Sasha,
there.
Sasha,
Comparing him
Sasha.
with these people, not
Yeah,
Biden.
Sasha,
Biden is
Sasha,
nothing.
Sasha, you've made your what you claim to be an unbiased opinion very, very clear that Trump is akin
Absolutely.
to him.
I'm not hiding
But
my
I'm,
opinion. I'm
but
too
I'm, yeah, that's
old
fine.
to hide my
I'm not
opinions, you know?
I'm
Well,
not
in
asking you to
respect,
change
in
your
respect
opinion.
of Dr.
I'm
Lindemann,
not
I'm
asking
going
you
to.
to change your opinion, but I am comparing the
Sorry,
two,
Dr. Lindemann.
the two current who are likely to be the next presidential nominees, right? Which is Biden and Trump, and I'm just talking about their policies. So when you want to fact check one side, you should fact check the other, and I think that it's really biased not to. In relation to Biden, I don't know if it's certain yet that Biden's going to run. I think that Biden's been buoyed by really what has been a very good result for the Democrats. But whoever runs for the Republicans, if Trump runs, he's going to run on his previous policies of why they're better and, was your life better? Was the economy better under his leadership? That's what he's going to run on. What Republicans have not done a very good job of in the midterms, and what they're going to have to do a very good job of in the next election, is they're going to have to talk about the things that are mattering to the voters. So those are things like access to healthcare. Yes, it's about economic issues, but it's not just enough to say that the other side's not doing a very good job of the economy.
Well,
You've really got to articulate what your plan is and how it's going to be better.
I'm going to finish up before I hand it over to Dr. Lindemann. We'll come back on either tomorrow or Friday to follow up on this conversation because I do think it's important. And Shaquille, you're right. We need to fact check what President Biden is saying. I was just talking about the numbers, which were very off. 18.6 billion in Afghanistan. It wasn't even close on some of these things. So we will fact check the former president.
Well, those were the numbers. Those were the numbers that were given not just to the American press corps. It was given to the rest of the world that there was that amount of weaponry and military equipment that was left behind in Afghanistan. And I think it's a bit amusing, really, to hear Chris Greco say that America should all of a sudden jump up and basically say, well, we're going to go into, if you muck around, we'll show you how to muck around. You're talking about a country that's just done what it's done to Afghanistan, that has embarrassed not just the United States military services, but my two countries' military services in the UK and in Australia, let alone all the other allied forces. You're talking about a president that actually got censured by the British Parliament. I mean, this is ridiculous. And Chris, I might just remind you that when the United States was in Iraq and Desert Storm and when they went back there in the late 90s, that Bill Clinton and I'm not blaming him. The Republicans were not much better, but he just happened to be the president at the time. But I'm going to talk about this. That basically you had such a demoralized U.S. naval force where they were flying over Saddam Hussein's areas, and he had his men shooting at those planes in breach of an international agreement. Saddam Hussein just continued to do it, and there was no reaction, and it demoralized the
They had the RTB, man, return to base. I remember that.
If you think the politicians go central power away from military generals and centralize it to Washington, if you think that they're going to all of a sudden stand up and play chicken with Russia, unfortunately, I don't think so. And I think that really the move is going to have to come from some powerful European countries like Germany, like France, your favorite, and of course, like the United Kingdom. They have to jump up and say, look, enough is enough. And I've said that when this first happened. We in the West have not done enough for the Ukrainians.
My final thought, and then I've got to run, but real quickly, we're going to continue these conversations. I will say this. I do think it's a loss for the President Trump that Ivanka Trump will no longer be a part of his cabinet, his team, because I think she was the smartest link and always has been his right hand running the Trump organization. So I think that's a really bad sign for Trump. My prediction is that I think the only Democrat that can beat Trump is Biden. That's what the polls say today. So I think it'll be interesting to see whether a lot of that depends on the economy and whether the Trump base comes out. So that's my prediction.
Don't trust those polls so much, Dave. But before you go, I'll just leave you with this thought. The last president that did come back and go back to the White House was, as you know, Grover Cleveland. And hey, he married a 21-year-old girl and had his marriage ceremony at the White House. So maybe Trump's going to trade in for a younger model.
You never know. Well, I'll be back tomorrow. Dr. Lindemann, hand over to you. I'm sorry you have to leave early, but thank you for being with us. And I'm at a conference, so, but great to be here with everybody, and thank you for listening and engaging. And we'll continue these discussions. Much to talk about. And Sasha, look forward to your updates on your show this week. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Dr. Lindemann, and that's where I was going in the conversation, because I do know that you've had some thoughts about the impact of Roe versus Wade. I don't know if you have any thoughts around that, even in the terms of the political landscape, but I would love to hear your thoughts and all in that space. You heard some of the heated discussion, but we do respect and enjoy each other, even when we disagree, as you can tell. But definitely, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts in that respect.
Well, I tell you, if I didn't have an opinion about Roe v. Wade, I'd probably be dead. So I do, of course. There's no other option than to have an opinion. But first of all, I think that the Supreme Court is the best friend the Republican or the Democratic Party has had for a long time. You know, I'm almost 75 now, and I've been learning about Twitter, you see. So I go to Twitter for a lot of my news, and what I see, and this is very common now, you've got the freedom, the healthcare freedom, the reproductive rights on one hand, and you have the rising cost of soup on the other hand, and they don't even come into the same idea, you know. So this is what brought out the people who don't usually come out to vote, you know, the 20 to 25-year-old women. And of course, if you look at Twitter and you look at the videos, you can see young men out there too. So a group that ordinarily doesn't come out came out. And that's what the Supreme Court did. They mobilized that group. Now, what that means for the rest of the public, I think that we're going to get our reproductive rights back sooner or later. It's just a matter of time. I couldn't say exactly when. In the meantime, what happens? Well, you have some kind of crazy things happening. You have to go for some states, you have to go miles, and some like Texas, you're not even supposed to leave Texas for a pregnancy termination. So, and then you've got these abortion pills coming from Mexico. And I expect what happens is they come from this country to Mexico and then back from Mexico to this country. So we're having a lot of the things that we had 60 and 70 years ago. What I hope you don't see is a return to illegal abortions. That is, when it was a crime years ago, there were women who didn't go back to their abortion person, whoever did it, because they were worried about going to prison for having their abortion. So they died at home. And if they went back, a lot of them wound up in pieces in the dumpster. And that's what Roe v. Wade was all about back in 1973, is to keep our young women out of the dumpsters.
I'm sorry. Is this about the young women or about the physicians doing the abortions? I don't know anyone's that's saying that the mothers should be prosecuted. It's the doctors.
Actually, I do think that in some states it's the mothers, and it used to be that way too. Certainly, doctors can get into a lot of trouble, even just, I would say, talking about it. But yes, there are states that are arresting doctors, accusing them of crimes, and then threatening them with a 5-year prison term. So yes, these things are ugly, and doctors are afraid of it. They're very afraid of these laws.
Don't know if anybody else got any. Go ahead.
Let me respond to a couple of things here. So, in the Dobbs case, the challenge would only have brought the abortion rules in line with what is the international standard across Europe and Canada, Australia, other wealthy Western countries. So the idea that it's somehow incredibly oppressive to have any kind of abortion restrictions in the United States, it's incredibly oppressive on women, but it's not incredibly oppressive on women in Denmark. It's not oppressive on women in Sweden. I mean, I'm not buying that argument personally, but I will say, look, in my view, and I've never said where I stand on abortion. I'm not going to say that today. But in my view, I think that it's important important that the views of the majority are really what is enshrined in law, as opposed to Republicans that seem to, or conservatives that seem to want to outlaw it in almost all circumstances, and Democrats that seem to want to allow it in almost all circumstances. That's just not where the polls show the majority of Americans being. But I think that the other issue is that because of how polarized the topic is, it's very hard to have any kind of reasonable conversation. The criticism that you've got for places like Texas that are suggesting that they'll pass laws that say that if a woman goes to another state in order to get an abortion, she can be prosecuted for that back at home. I don't think that would actually stand up to a legal challenge personally. But more importantly, they shouldn't be doing it in the first place. They shouldn't be passing laws like that in the first place. Lindsey Graham, after Republicans said, we're not going to federalize this, we just want the democratic process to be followed, and so this should be kicked back to the states. Lindsey Graham then tries to pass something or introduce something onto the floor to federalize a national abortion ban. So that's just not what should be happening. But I do want to say, I sort of question the logic of both sides of this argument in the United States. Now, obviously, I'm not American, so I don't really have any skin in the game here. But I do question the logic. I hear conservatives say, well, we'll make an exception in the case of rapes, or we'll make an exception in this case or that case. Well, if you're going to make an exception in the case of rapes, how exactly are you going to enforce that? Well, what's going to stop a woman from going and saying, yeah, look, I was raped? Are you going to force her to name her rapist? I mean, that's not going to work. So those sorts of rules, I think, are unhelpful. But also what becomes unhelpful is where a pregnancy becomes high risk. And one of the exceptions that you have clearly in law in most of Europe, in Australia, etc., is that if it's a late-term pregnancy, a pregnancy where the child could actually survive outside the womb, and that seems to be one of the sticking points between Republicans and Democrats, is what happens in that case where something has gone wrong with the pregnancy, and unfortunately, it's a very difficult conversation for doctors to have, as I'm sure you would have experienced in your long career. What do you do in that circumstance? And to handcuff doctors and say, well, you just can't do it, there's no exceptions. That's a dangerous legal constriction on doctors, preventing them from doing what's probably in the best interest of the patients involved. But on the other hand, you've got Democrats that are passing like laws that say, well, if it's a failed abortion, how about we don't provide medical care to the fetus if it has a chance of surviving, which is something that one of our guests brought my attention to. But also, the part birth abortion bans and things like that, or allowing part birth abortions. I know Republicans are describing it as part birth abortions, and probably the alternative is worse. But this is not, I think, what most people have in mind. I don't think most people who support abortions being more legal have the idea that, if you're on the delivery table and you all of a sudden change your mind, then the doctor should perform an abortion. I don't really think that that's what people have in mind. I think people are talking about where it's a mistake, where it's fairly early in the pregnancy, etc. And so when it's this polarized, just like most issues in America, when it's this polarized, I just don't think you get anywhere, because you can't talk about these types of scenarios.
Speaking of polarization, go ahead, Dr. Lindemann.
I just want to say one thing, Shaquille. The problem that we have right now, and this is what got all the young people jacked up on this, is you can't take something away from them that they have had and that they want and that they know they can have. And that's why it's so hot. That's why they came out to vote.
Well, but you're not necessarily
This is changing the subject a little bit, just real quickly, Shaquille. They're trying to do that with the Second Amendment, no problem. Why is that different?
Is that to me or is that to Dr. Lindemann?
That's the doctor who said, you can't take something away from people who've had something for a period of time.
Okay, so you're talking about firearms?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah. Well, that certainly is the point. You can't take weapons away from somebody who's had weapons for, 40, 50, or 60 years. They certainly think they have a right to have one. I personally have never had a weapon in the house.
By choice.
I don't need one. I have no desire to shoot anything. So I guess I'm a real pacifist. But I do know there's one very serious problem with having weapons handy, and that is suicide. And I guess there's two: suicide and homicide. If you look at suicide, most people think of suicide for maybe 5 or 15 minutes, and it's very spontaneous. So if they have something around that'll fix that in 5 minutes, they take it. If they miss or think about it for another 5 minutes, they're not suicidal anymore. So I do think that is a real threat to a lot of people.
With all due respect, Doctor, I don't think that the evidence doesn't support that, because there's no need for mental health intervention. If that was true, people get very, very depressed. They suffer for a long time, and the crazy government in Canada has decided to allow juveniles to have assisted euthanasia as a treatment for long-term depression. I mean, and you see that in Europe as well, but not normally for juveniles. But mental health intervention isn't going to work if people are only thinking about it for a very short time. I think people have suicidal tendencies, tend to have them for a long time, and there's a lot of warning signs to look out for. And that's certainly how mental health staff, police, ambulance officers, that sort of stuff, that's what they're trained to spot. So school counsellors, etc., are all trained to address those, or to look for those signs. While we go, I'll just say something very quickly, and then I'll hand it back to you guys. Earlier in the show, you talked about the higher rate of infant mortality in the United States, and I think the way that you phrased it sort of suggested that there was racism at play that causes these higher death rates, and I don't think that that's. I don't think that is a major causal factor in the higher mortality rates. If you actually have a look at infant mortality in the United States, you see that happens in much poorer states. You see that the people that are having these issues are coming from poorer backgrounds. Now, whilst it's true that, yes, black people disproportionately fit into that category, if it's racism at play, then you'd have to explain why non-Latino or non-Hispanic Asians, for example, have a lower death rate than whites. They've got the lowest across the board. So I don't buy that medical staff are racist against some people but not others. That doesn't make sense to me.
I don't think the doctor was saying racist, Shaquille. I think the doctor was saying uninformed.
Go back and have a look, because he said that doctors during their early times, they have to think like a white person, etc. So that's why I said that sounded like that's what you're alluding to. But I'll also just say that there are a couple of other things, to be fair to the United States, that are distorting the figures. Some countries in Europe don't count certain births as being births; they count them as being stillborn, where the United States counts them as being births. So you have to adjust your statistics to account for that. But you also have to adjust your statistics to account for there is a higher tendency for premature births in the United States than there is in Europe, if that's what we're comparing it to. And so those things mean that those babies have got lower survival chances. But leaving all that aside, yes, the infant mortality rate is higher in the United States. And one of the issues that I see, and I've mentioned this in other shows, is when the AMA spends hundreds of millions of dollars giving that to universities and colleges to artificially depress the numbers of medical graduates in order to make sure that you have approximately half the amount of doctors per population per capita as other countries. You by coincidence also have a doubling of the costs. And so that is something that I think needs to be looked at, and not just the sort of evil capitalists that are putting human life second. It's a lot of this has to do with government intervention, government regulations by lobby groups such as the AMA and the pharmaceuticals that fund it.
No doubt about that. And I know we were grinding down. I think we got about another 5 or 6 minutes. There was a couple of other issues that I was going to bring in. And to your point, Shaquille, I think there was a documentary, and Dr. Linderman may have some thoughts about this as we wind down. But I think there was a documentary about the rise or the disparity that exists between African-American women that were having babies and others around their prenatal care that was released recently. I think it was on Netflix or something along those lines.
But again, if healthcare is, as you guys tell me constantly, healthcare in America is so expensive, it's inaccessible to poorer people. If you've just put yourself through colleges and universities, you've got a degree that's taken, a specialty that's taken you 10, 11, 12 years to get, you've got $300,000 in debt. Would you be practicing in a place where you're going to earn the highest amount of money, or are you going to go and practice in rural Mississippi? I mean, it's not racism. It's that people are trying to earn as much as they can, and this is a failure of the American medical system compared to other countries. But I don't think that it helps in any way to put it down to racism when it's probably got more to do with economics. I don't think that you're going to find that a very wealthy area is going to discriminate against black people. If you go to birthing clinics in Beverly Hills, I don't think you're going to find that wealthy black actors are having worse results than white people are having. That just doesn't stand true, and the statistics don't support that either.
I think you're right, Shaquille. I think it's always been a measure of class. I think, though, that you have to bring in the differences, like you said, in Europe. As I said before, Norway is Norwegians, Swedes Swedish. You don't have the same type of differences in culture that you would have here in the United States. And that lends itself to be more complex and more complexity, and the class issue just brings a real nightmare for doctors.
And a lot of people would argue that the two are related, but that is for another discussion. And I can bring on some people like Sandy, Verity, and others that can bring in the class and the race are interrelated, and that they are not necessarily separate, and all of that. That's a whole conversation.
We can debate that. We can debate that another time.
That's why I said we can debate that another time. That's why.
But whatever you say about it, you're still going to have to convince me, for me to buy your argument, that the people of color are being discriminated against in some circumstances when it comes to African Americans, but not in other circumstances when it comes to Indians like myself and Steve Rao.
There's a direct connection between money and access. That's extremely important. The other problem is you can't blame the patient. I know that's what ACOG does to make themselves look better, but you can't do that. You're going to screw your patient, and you're going to screw their care, and you're going to screw yourself. You can't do it. Access is the problem. And that's a bigger...
I'm sorry, doctor. You
can't blame the patient. I'm a smoker.
Sometimes there's behavioral choices patients make.
You may have patients who are naughty or don't do what you want them to, but you can't stop caring about them. And you
100%. I agree.
I would like to mention, though, that the problem with access does not exist in Canada. For example, in province of Ontario, where I live, everyone has access.
Shaquille?
And this goes without saying. In a country like United States, where 50% of the population don't have access to lay $400 in case of emergency if they need, what kind of access are we talking about? And
Shaquille?
the number is 50%. It's incredible. I'm not even prepared to discuss.
I'm sorry, Shaquille, just one quick question. During COVID, patients were denied access if they didn't have the vaccine. I know this in America. I don't know about Canada.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation we can get into. Yeah, and that's a whole other conversation we can get into. One other thing I was going to bring in just really quickly, and I definitely want to talk about this tomorrow and everything, but there is because we oftentimes talk about different groups, and it's not always around race. Sometimes it's around orientation. And apparently there is a same-sex marriage bill that is picking up Senate support, and it's actually Senate GOP support. And a part of what they're doing, which is another conversation we've had on the news, is that they are tying religious freedom into the law. So whatever law is passed will protect the same-sex marriage folks, but it will also give freedom of religion. So the two are being intertwined together, and we do know that happens quite a bit in bills and all of that.
Well, I think it's going to be an interesting question. If you can't force somebody to bake you a cake, can you force a doctor to say that you're a birthing person and ask you whether you're planning on chest feeding your child? Can you force a doctor to say that to all patients, regardless of whether they're trans or not? I mean, I don't think that you should be able to do that. I think that if a patient wants to be talked to differently using different language, then they should make that clear, and doctors should have the choice to opt out if they so please.
So real quick, my share screen. Sorry, Sasha, you have problems in Canada. Now, it may not be in Ontario, but definitely that, there it is. CBC says it, and I just saw it on the news about a week ago or so. Every country has problems with healthcare, including Canada. And this is Saskatchewan, and I get it. It's out on the west side with all the rural areas and all that stuff. But the bottom line
Excuse me,
there's
don't mix the facts with your rhetoric. It's a completely different issue. I'm talking about the access to the healthcare in Canada, and particularly in Ontario, where it's 100% universal and free for everybody without paying even 1 penny out of your pocket. You had first-class medical help. I know it on my own experience when a few months ago, unfortunately, my wife fell and broke her hip. She was operated next day. She was admitted the same day. The ambulance was there in 5 minutes, delivered her to the hospital. She was prepared for the operation. Next week, operated, stayed there for 6 days, then 3 weeks in rehabilitation center, and she was brought by special vehicle from the hospital to rehabilitation care center, and from there they brought her home. So all thing almost a month long, didn't cost me out of pocket zero. Didn't cost me.
Sasha, to be fair, firstly, yes, you talk about Ontario, that might be the case. BC has a charge of their residents for healthcare, but to be fair, the health system in Canada has been criticised for falling behind because of funding. And universal health may work reasonably well, especially in Commonwealth countries like you and I both live in. But in a country like the United States, universal health or single payer health, I don't see how that's going to work. They would be far better off trying to adopt a system like they have in Switzerland than trying to adopt a system like they have in the UK, Canada, or Australia. Right, universal health with a single payer system under what we call in Australia Medicare, and you have a similar system in Canada, is probably not the right solution for the United States. But also,
if healthcare would be run by states in each state, they could do it.
Well, there is a level of federal funding there. But when you have a huge influx of immigrants coming into Canada, when you have people that are coming in who are not documented properly, etc., coming into Canada, that causes a delay. That causes a bottleneck for Canadians that have already paid into the system. And I think that it's folly to ignore that and then suggest that America should adopt the same sort of system, because
No,
I know...
I'm not suggesting America to adopt anything. America can do anything what it wants.
Hey, Shaquille and Sasha, it is about that time, so we do need to wrap up. We're just going to mention just one other quick thing.
Good having you, Dr. I'm so glad you're on. Hopefully you'll be back. Hopefully.
Yeah. I was going to say the same thing. I do hope that Dr. Lindemann will make a return trip. I was definitely enjoying his commentary. And of course, we've had some other folks that have made some commentary as well. I cannot remember or not. I know that Nick, one of our founders, is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as the Mormons. And I know that Dan is as well. I think Lee is, but I can't remember at all in that space. But they were one of the groups that actually did endorse their support for the same-day bill, and the same-sex bill, because they said that it included appropriate religious freedom protections while respecting the laws and preserving the rights of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. And they were some of the groups, along with the National Association of Manufacturers, whoever the heck they are, and all in that space. But those are some of the groups that came out in support. So since we have our founder as a part of that group, I thought I'd give them a shout out, and all in that space. But we can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing on tomorrow's show and on Friday's show as well. And Dr. Lindemann, glad that you were able to join us, and hope that you will make a return trip. I know this is your second time, but we are always glad to get your insights as well. So anytime that we can have you, it is a privilege, and we're always glad to have you on and all in that space.
Thank you so much, Mark. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
All right, so we're great.
Bye, sir.
As we get ready to get on out of here.